I grew up in a small town called Possum Post, West Virginia. This was the 90s, and it was a time when our Main Street was going the way of many main streets at that time. It was being replaced by malls and box stores until this once bustling center of commerce and capitalism struggled to hold on to more than just a few key stores. We had a hardware store, we had a pawn shop. Way down at one end, there was a bookstore of a certain variety. But every year, on December 20th, our town came alive again. It was filled with people for our annual Christmas celebration. There was a Christmas parade, there was a bake sale, there was a screening of It's a Wonderful Life. We'd all pack into the old palace, see this old movie house on Main Street, and we'd watch a movie together. And every store that was still on that street, they would open their doors and they would serve free hot cocoa. Except for the bookstore of a certain variety. They had an Earl Grey tea. But as kids, we loved to go to this parade, and we loved everything about it. And as we got to be slightly older kids, we got to be in the parade. Heading into middle school, my friends Andy and Calvin and I, we finally made the cut for our middle school marching band. Now, of all the kids in our school, only those who signed up got to be a part of this prestigious group. And only those who signed up late were assigned to play the sousaphone. And this was the instrument Calvin and I were assigned to. Annie was assigned to play the piccolo. And the sousaphone, if you're not familiar with it, it is the biggest instrument you could ever imagine marching with. It looks like a muffler designed by Dr. Seuss. Well, we were excited. We were in the band, and we had our first day of band camp, and we were supposed to report to the band room where we were going to meet with our section leader. It was a kid named Barnaby Berry. I didn't know Barnaby well, but I always liked him. Like anybody whose name is alliterative. Barnaby was tall for his age. He was around 6 foot, but he was rail thin. If I had to guess, I would say he weighed about 6 pounds less than a sousaphone. But Calvin and I walked into the band room. He was very excited. He sat us down and he said, "Observe!" And he set about showing us how to put the sousaphone on. And he started sweating and swearing and straining. It looked like a boa constrictor attacking a rake, but it was an entertaining 30 minutes for Calvin and I. We didn't know which one of them might win, but our money was on the sousaphone. Finally, he gets this thing on, it's safely crushing all of his bones together, and he begins showing us the fingerings for the notes. And Calvin and I were fascinated to learn everything we could about the sousaphone. And Barnaby was fascinated that two people who had survived for this long on Earth could be so confused by just 3 buttons on one instrument. Luckily, his impending nervous breakdown was interrupted, and there was a knock at the door. I went to answer it, and there stood Mary, the leader of the piccolos, and she had Annie with her. I said, "Hello, Mary." She said, "Hello. Annie is no longer going to be able to play the piccolo." I said, "Okay." She said, "We think it would be best if she were with you all in the sousaphones." And I looked over to our section leader to check on this, but Barnaby was just standing there staring. He was just completely out of this world. So Mary kept talking. She said, "You see, Annie has done something to her fife so that it will only play very, very high notes." I said, "Okay, but isn't that the exact thing the piccolo is supposed to do? I don't see what the problem is here." And no sooner had I said that, there came a rumble in the corner of the hallway. And there on the bed came about 30-odd bloodhounds and every stray dog in town barreling down the hall wondering who the heck had called them. And so I said, "Of course, we'd be happy to have Annie amongst the sousaphones." Annie stepped into the room. Mary stepped back into the hallway where she was immediately swept onto the backs of 30-odd baying bloodhounds and every stray dog in town as an accidental crowd surfer. And I, of course, helped by closing the door. It was getting kind of loud out there. And we went to check on Barnaby. I eventually got him to come to, and he said, "How did I do? Did I say anything stupid while Mary was here?" And Annie said, "No, you didn't say anything stupid. Your face, it said it all for you." Barnaby sank down into a chair, and it was clear that whatever had just happened there was going to take precedent over our sousaphones. So we got to talk about Barnaby, and by he came around to tell us how he had fallen in love with Mary years ago, and his biggest hope that year was that he would ask her to the winter ball. But he hadn't been able to bring himself to do it. And I know, before you go judging Barnaby as a coward, though, I want to remind you of how high-stakes relationships are in small towns. In a small town, you have history with everybody. And that girl you want to ask to the dance could be the same girl you were sitting next to the day you wet your pants in 2nd grade, rather than get up to go to the bathroom because you didn't want to miss the exciting conclusion of reading Rainbow. That happened to a friend of mine that I used to be. High stakes as it was, asking Mary out. There was no doubt these two were made for each other. If they went to the dance, someday they might start dating, and then he might propose marriage. And to propose marriage He would have to ask her if he could make her a very merry, Mary, Berry, Schmary, Berry, and come Mary, Berry. And their love story would forever be told as a tongue twister before community theater productions in Possum Post. So we promised our section leader right then and there that we were going to help him win the heart of Mary. But first we had a more immediate concern, as that was that we now had a fourth sousaphone player, but only 3 sousaphones. We went to our band teacher, Mr. P, and we let him know we needed a fourth sousaphone. He started making some calls around town, and he eventually found one with a man named Mr. Wilthorne. Mr. Wilthorne was a widower. He was an old man, and his wife had once been the band teacher at our school. During that time, he was known to tinker around with the instruments, fix them up, repairing them as needed, and apparently he still had a few laying around the house. But we all knew him. We knew him because he was just everywhere in our town at one time. He was on every committee, he marched in every parade, you just saw him everywhere, until you didn't. And it seemed like he and the town had just started to part ways. And I think some of it's just that change can be hard to keep up with. As Main Street had all but disappeared, the people he had known had moved on, some had passed on, he just started to feel like he lost his place in our town. But Mr. P got in touch with him that day, and he agreed his neighbor was going to help him load up the sousaphone, and he would bring it down to our school. We discussed it amongst ourselves, and we agreed that I would get the new sousaphone, as we were unsure of its quality, if it was even playable. But we all agreed that if it wasn't playable, I would sound a lot better. So the next day, third period, I got the call to go down to the band room and meet with Mr. Wilthorne and pick up the sousaphone. And when I met with him, the first impression I had was that the old man seemed to smile at everything. It was like everything that was happening around him was just a happy accident in his favor. And he was so excited to show me the sousaphone. He spent about 20 minutes explaining to me how to prevent the non-compensating piston valve from sticking. And I spent around 20 minutes pretending I knew what that was. And then I shook his hand, I said goodbye, and I headed back to math class. And I can remember that day, I still wasn't sure if PEMDAS was our math teacher's name or why they kept writing that on the board. But I knew I had a friend in Mr. Wilthorne. That marching band season was a memorable one, though, for sure. Our band teacher, Mr. P, he was the son of 2 bankers in town. And his father's greatest fear when he went to college was that he would major in music. His mother's greatest fear was that he was going to major in philosophy. And not wanting to disappoint either of them, he became a dual major. Thus, while other bands were doing shows that were based on the soundtracks from summer blockbusters, we performed an original composition by Mr. P that was based on Kierkegaard's Sickness Unto Death. He even gave us paperback copies of Sickness Unto Death with which we could confuse ourselves. But all that year we marched, we played with Barnaby, we looked longingly at instruments that didn't cause back problems. And then during our breaks, we would scheme of ways that he might ask Mary to the dance until we had the perfect plan. And this was it. When the night of the Christmas parade rolled around, we had a way for him to ask Mary to the dance. So on December 20th, we all showed up on Main Street, we were dressed in our red and green uniforms, we were ready to march. Now, our marching band consisted of 35 dedicated musicians, but also Annie and Calvin and me. So there were 38 people total. Wow. Made us the biggest group in the whole band. They saved, or the whole parade. They saved us for the very end. We were right behind a hay wagon pulled by a tractor, which was very exciting because normally in our town, if you wanted to see a hay wagon pulled by a tractor, you had to go outside. The parade route would follow Main Street, and we would go past the old Palace Theater. Once we got past the Palace Theater, we would disperse. And outside the Palace Theater was where the Queen Street Baking Society arranged their annual bake sale. And they sold pies and cookies and cakes. They weren't just good. They would change your life. Every year, you'd save up all your money, you'd shove it in your pockets, and when you got to that bake sale, you would hurl it at the nearest old lady you could find, and with baked treats in hand, you would walk into the Palace Theater and you'd watch It's a Wonderful Life with your whole town on the big screen. Now, we learned from Barnaby that last year, he ended up sitting next to Mary during It's a Wonderful Life. And she had cried at the scene where George and Mary are walking home from the dance, and George offers to throw a lasso around the moon and bring it down for her. She said it was the most romantic thing she'd ever seen in a movie. And from this knowledge, we devised our plan. Andy's cousin Skip made signs for a living, and they were beautiful signs. Skip signs were known all over town, beautiful calligraphy. They usually had a few mistakes on them, and so for that reason, Skip sold them dirt cheap. So we went down to Skip's sing shop, and we placed a special order. The idea was this. When we got in front of the Palace Theater, we were going to have a banner hidden up on a hay wagon. And Barnaby would jump up on the hay wagon, pull cord, the banner would unravel, and we would have that line, "Do you want the moon, Mary?" Signed, Barnaby. It was a perfect plan. Now, if we timed everything out, we were going to be playing "We Wish You a Merry Christmas" as we passed in front of the theater. We were pretty sure that was the song we were going to be playing at that point because that was the only song we had learned for the parade. So we're marching down Main Street, "We wish you a Merry Christmas, we wish you a Merry Christmas." We get in front of the old Palace Theater, and I get Barnaby the signal. When he sees that signal, with superhuman strength, he lifts that sousaphone off of him, and he throws it next to him to his kid, Lou, who eventually recovered. And he jumps up on the back of that hay wagon, and he pulls the cord, and the banner unravels, and there, lit up beneath the lights of the palace marquee, is our message. "I want to moon you, Mary." Signed, Barnaby. The parade came to a halt. People stopped staring, wondering perhaps what would possess a person to make such a sign. But Mary just smiled. She said, "I'll take it." We went to the theater that night watching "It's a Wonderful Life" as Mary sat with her head on Barnaby's shoulder. It was young love watching an old movie in an ancient movie house. And the whole town scene was there. Everyone, that is, except for Mr. Wilthorne. Well, it wasn't long after that, or actually a few months after that, to say, winter rolled on by, and there was no marching band in the spring, so we had to figure out something else to do with our time. And we all took jobs. Annie, Calvin, and I, we found a job working for a local farmer named Mr. Kennedy. And Mr. Kennedy wasn't his real name, but he was from Massachusetts, so we called him Mr. Kennedy. He wasn't actually from Massachusetts, but he had driven through Massachusetts, and we liked nicknames, so we called him Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Kennedy kept about 30 head of cattle on his farm, and I use that term "kept" loosely. The old man, it seemed, ran his farm on the honors system, and his fence was really just a suggestion as far as the cows were concerned. In fact, his Holsteins were spotted all over. They were spotted at the Dairy Queen, checking to see how people were enjoying their fine product. They were spotted down Main Street one day, staring judgingly into a leather goods store. One had even wandered into our church, putting to a test our pastor's proclamation that all were welcome. But he hired us to do odd jobs. We were just painting, we were fixing things up. One day, we were joyfully mucking out a stall for a cow named Thelma, and I wondered out loud why these cows ever wandered off in the first place. I said, they've got everything they need right here. They've got food, they've got water and shelter, they've got a nearly muckless stall. And Annie said, "Sometimes, Jim, you just got to go for a walk and figure things out." And not long after that, Mr. Kennedy came rushing in, and his cows had gotten out again. He said, "Can you help me come find them?" I said, "Sure." We piled in the back of the truck. His cow had been spotted last seen out on this mountain, which was near where Mr. Wilthorne lived. So we rode in the back of the truck all the way out there. And don't worry, it was the 90s, so it was perfectly safe back then. And we got out there and dispersed across this mountain looking for the cow. I thought to just go ask Mr. Wilthorne if maybe he had seen it. And I got to the end of his driveway, and I saw the first thing that really surprised me that day, and that was there was a for sale sign at the end of his drive. And Mr. Wilthorne lived in the same house his whole life. He was in his late 70s. His father lived there, his grandfather. Nobody had ever lived in that house with Wilthornes. I got to the top of the drive, and I saw the second thing that surprised me, and that was Mr. Wilthorne was right there sitting on his front porch in a rocking chair. He had a cup of coffee and a biscuit, and he was standing about 5 feet from the missing cow who had walked up onto the porch, and it looked like they were deep in conversation, but I was at least 54% sure that wasn't possible. He saw me, immediately waved me over, and he offered me a cup of coffee and a biscuit. For what I remember of the taste and texture of that coffee at 13, it was either Folgers or Pennzoil. The old man loved to talk. He sat me down and he was peppered with questions about school, about the band, about everything happening in our town. And then he started to tell me stories. Stories about growing up in Possum Post so long ago, of all the people he had known, the things he had done, of what it was like when I had a streetcar to ride that down Main Street. And then finally, ignoring the cow on the porch, I addressed the elephant in the room, and I asked about the for sale sign. And he said he had given it a lot of thought, and then after 78 years in one place, he was going to be moving on. He bought a condo down south. He was going to head that way in the new year. I said, "Won't you be sad to leave this place when you're home for all this time?" He said, "Truthfully, yes. And to leave this place would be a death in some way. That the Mr. Wilthorne of Possum Post would cease to exist." And he was excited for new adventures, too, to maybe learn golf or at least wear ridiculous pants in public. We talked for a while longer, and eventually I harnessed up the cow, I said my goodbyes, and I was on my way. Oh, it wasn't but 2 weeks after this that I decided to run for class president of Possum Post Middle School. As with any political campaign, I thought the hard part is getting elected, and then after that, you don't have to do anything. There was one other candidate for office, and that was a girl named Jennifer Moon. And the whole thing was going to be decided by a debate. There was going to be a debate held on the cafeteria stage. We had a stage in our cafeteria, and it was going to be moderated by our civics teacher, Mr. Donahue. We were very excited to get up there and speak in front of everyone. We had 3 things that we had to talk about. The first pillar of the Possum Post presidential campaign was a school lunch. The class president got to choose one new lunch menu item that they would introduce to the school, be served the first day of school each month. They got to choose a community service project, and they got to choose a field trip, which had to occur within the city limits of a town that had nothing in it. Now, a funny thing about my opponent, Jennifer Moon, was that she hated me. And I never knew why. I couldn't remember any interaction we'd had that would cause any feeling toward one another whatsoever. But anyhow, we get up on stage and we're ready to do our little presentations. Mr. Donahue calls on Jennifer and she gets up and she gives her presentation. She says this. She says, our school lunch menu item should be a barbecue patty. Our field trip should be the buffalo farm. And our community service project should be installing a field goal post down at the old folks' home so they can practice kicking for an extra point. She was articulate, she was poised, and worst of all, she was brief. I had been panic scribbling these 3 pillars of the presidential post, or Possum Post presidential campaign since I first heard of them roughly 3 minutes earlier. Apparently a pamphlet had been sent home where we were supposed to realize these specific things we were supposed to talk about, and I had that pamphlet and didn't read it. So when they called me up to speak, I had to come up with something on the fly, and I stared out at the audience hoping some idea would come to me, and my eyes fell on the back of the cafeteria. There was a poster, an old Got Milk ad with a Holstein on it, and I remember that trip to Mr. Wilthorne's, and I started to think about what he had said about leaving this place being a death in some way. I thought about how it was wrong that he was going to leave and there wasn't going to really be a proper goodbye, and these ideas converged in my head, and I blurted out that I am going to plan the funeral for Mr. Wilthorne. Now that death was involved, I had the 8th graders' attention, and they all turned around and looked at me. Mr. Donahue said, Mr. Edwin Wilthorne? I'd never called an adult by their first name in my life, so I said, probably. He said, but Edwin Wilthorne is still alive. And I said, for now. Which sounded way more like a death threat than I meant for it to. When I recovered, I said, this will be a living funeral. And our class trip is going to be to take you all to attend his living funeral. Now, a living funeral was just a concept I had heard on an ad for a TV movie that was on too late for me to stay up. I said, our class trip's going to be to go see him, and then our new lunch menu item is going to be his very favorite meal, or the only one I've ever seen him eat, and that is a cup of coffee and a biscuit. Suddenly, Jennifer jumped up. She said, this is ridiculous. He can't offer to take the class to a funeral for a man who isn't dead. I said, yet. She said, and offer them a biscuit and a cup of coffee and an addictive substance for lunch. Mr. Donahue said, Jim, would you like to respond to Jesse's concerns? I said, yes, I would. Who's Jesse? And there was a growling next to me, and the wheels in my head began to turn, and suddenly I figured it out, and I said, is your name not Jennifer? And she said, no, you keep calling me Jennifer. For years you called me Jennifer, and I keep correcting you. I keep saying, it's Jesse, it's Jesse, it's Jesse. I said, oh, I thought that you thought that my name was Jesse. She said, if you thought that I thought that your name was Jesse, why wouldn't you correct me? I said, I don't know. I really never liked the name Jim. I thought maybe I'll try Jesse. And then she started jumping up and down and yelling things into the microphone. You're not supposed to yell into a microphone. And Mr. Donahue got very upset, and I felt terrible. It was my inability to remember names that had caused this whole fiasco, and I hoped there would be any sort of distraction. When luckily, there wandered in through the back of the cafeteria one of Mr. Kennedy's cows. And seeing it, I immediately yelled the most clever thing I could think of, which was, there's a cow. And everybody turned around, there was a great commotion, and the FFA sprung into action. A sea of blue corduroy surrounded them. Road cows were what they trained for. I think I wasn't in the FFA. But they couldn't get her under control. She had this searching in her eye, this desperation, and Annie saw it. And Annie jumped up, she parted that sea of blue corduroy, she pulled from her back pocket that old beat-up copy of Kierkegaard's Sickness Unto Death, and she began to read to her, page after page. And gradually, the cow settled. Finally, Annie, she looked her right in the eye, and she said, Thelma, it is an infinite merit to be able to despair. I know it sounds far-fetched to suggest that Kierkegaard's Sickness Unto Death made sense to any living thing. But it made sense to Thelma. And this look of clarity filled those big glassy eyes, and she turned around and she walked out of there, head held high. I was named the next class president at the Possum Post Middle School, and I began the process of fulfilling all my promises. First, I knew I owed Mr. Wilthorne a talk, because I would certainly want somebody to let me know if they had plans for my funeral, at least to find out if they were going to murder me. And it took some convincing, but by and by he agreed. This was a way to let the town say goodbye to him. He only had one condition. He said there's only one place and time to do this. December 20th at 7 p.m. The night of the Possum Post Christmas parade and bake sale. I had 7 months to prepare. But instead, I waited until about 10 days beforehand and started really preparing in earnest. The first thing I had to do was go convince the Queen Street Baking Society. They arranged the bake sale, they arranged the screening of It's a Wonderful Life, that I should be allowed to have a funeral, living funeral, before their screening. And they came around to it. They said, you can do that, but you can only have 15 minutes, which was perfect if I could figure out a way to fill 15 minutes. And so I came up with a plan. We'd have a song. We'd have some people come up and say nice things about Mr. Wilthorne, and then we would have another song. Now, we were still marching in the parade that night, so we all got in line, we marched through 8 rounds of We Wish You a Merry Christmas, and then Annie and Calvin and I, we ran over to the theater to get things ready. I went through the front door, and immediately the phone was ringing. I went and I picked it up, and it was Mrs. Peach, our church organist. She was the one I asked to play our hymn for that evening, and she said she was very sorry, but something come down with stomach bug, she wasn't going to be able to make it. Suddenly, 5 of my 15 minutes were gone. I was panicking a little from that when Mr. Wilthorne himself showed up. He was all dressed in a suit, it was really nice, he was ready for his living funeral, and I welcomed him, and I said, all right, Annie and Calvin are going to take you to your seat. What we're going to do is we have a microphone, and then we're going to have you sit to the right of the microphone. Like I said, I'd never been to a living funeral or seen one, but I had seen a VHS of a Dean Martin roast, and I thought, most of those guys are dead, so we sent him along his way. And then I had an idea. A great idea for some music. I ran outside and I found Barnaby and Mary. They were buying some lemon bars. And I said, Barnaby, would you do me a favor and play a sousaphone solo for us? He said, I'll do you one better. Mary and I will play a sousaphone and piccolo duet. I said, Barnaby, that's great. Do you know how great thou art? And he said, well, thank you, Jim. I think you're swell too. I said, the hymn, Barnaby, the hymn. And he said, no, I'm afraid there's really a pretty limited repertoire when it comes to sousaphone and piccolo arrangements. I said, whatever the two of you know that will fill 5 minutes, that is the song I need. Now, I had on a stand, as people entered, our classmates and townfolk were starting to come in, we had a stand there where we could sign in to eulogize Mr. Wilthorne. So I thought, before I go up on stage, I'm going to grab that and I'm going to introduce him to everybody. So I had that all set, and I got everybody ready to go on stage, and Barnaby and Mary came out, and they began to play what is perhaps the greatest funeral song ever written. One that reconciles the weight of loss with the beautiful burden of carrying on. They played Turkey in the Straw for a solid 5 minutes. I went back to check out our eulogizer sign-in sheet toward the end of it, and it was still empty. And now I was beginning to panic. I grabbed the book and I ran back and I found Annie. I said, Annie, this might be a disaster. I said, nobody signed in to speak. There's so much to say about this man. There's no one to say it. I don't know what to do. And Annie said, well, what about him? And I turned around and there was Mr. Wilthorne. He said, Jim, this whole thing is just swell, and I hoped I might have a few words with the town, if I might. And so we let Barnaby and Mary know. They stepped back, and Mr. Wilthorne stepped to the stage, and he said all he could say of life spent in a small town. I've seen the same people day in and day out, of doing the same thing every Christmas, of being a part of something. He said, it's been real neat. And then one by one, members of the audience got to their feet, and they began to say their piece. They remembered small kindnesses and little moments that added up to a big life lived in a tiny town. Jennifer Moon got up. Jessie Moon got up. And she said, you always say hello to everybody and you call them by name. And it was super sweet, even when she was staring daggers at me when she said it. Mr. Kennedy got up and he said, every time my cows got lost and they went to find you, they always came home seeming more at peace with themselves. Mr. P said, anytime when I was a student and I wanted to talk to somebody about philosophy, you'd sit there and you would listen to me and you would smile and you would nod. And that's really the best anybody can do when someone talks to them about philosophy. And on it went. And what I need to tell you is in that moment, we seem to remember the community that we were. Now, It's a Wonderful Life, while a fantastic film, is roughly 9 hours long. And so we knew that we had to wrap things up. I gave Mr. Wilton the signal, he stepped back, and Barnaby and Mary came out to play another round of Turkey in the Straw. And this time as they played, Mr. Wilton began to clap, the audience began to clap and stomp, and it was this wonderful moment of unity, and the song sounded beautiful, except that there was something different about the note. And I remembered seeing Mary pick up a piccolo from the back, and I remembered briefly seeing a name etched on it. And I realized Annie's piccolo. It was a barking that I was hearing. The doors of the theater burst open, and there came 30 odd bloodhounds and every stray dog in town barreling down the aisle like a river. They came up onto the stage, swept Mr. Wilthorne onto their backs, and carried him outside the theater. We chased him outside and watched as Mr. Wilthorne, crowd surfing on canines, took it all in. His hometown at its finest, beneath the twinkling Christmas lights and wreaths hung from lampposts, as children waited patiently to enter the Christmas tree celebration that was Satan's Wonderland, sponsored by Skip Sing Shop. A road cow clopped across the street, its eyes looking inward toward its own past. Christmas can be a magical time of year anywhere. Nowhere was it more magical than my hometown of Possum Post, West Virginia. Thank you.